The snow came down in sheets that afternoon, the kind that muffled everything: traffic, voices, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, until all of Denver felt wrapped in cotton. It was February, early, the light already gray by 3 o'clock. Ethan Cole was underneath a 2009 Ford F-150 when he heard the crunch. Tires on compacted ice. Not the slow spin of something in control. The other kind, the desperate, grinding kind. That means someone is stuck and doesn't know it yet. He didn't move right away. His hands were deep in the undercarriage, knuckles already cut from the cold, and he had 3 more minutes of work before he could breathe again. He finished, slid out from under the truck, wiped his hands on a rag that was already too dirty to do much good. Outside the garage door, half swallowed by a snowdrift, sat a car that had no business being in this neighborhood. It was black, longer than anything parked on this street had a right to be. Chrome trim that caught what little light was left in the sky, a Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith. He'd know the body anywhere, spinning its rear tires against a ridge of plowed snow that had frozen solid sometime in the last hour. The driver, a man in a dark coat, clearly unfamiliar with manual labor, was gunning the engine with the particular confidence of someone who has never once been stuck. Ethan pulled his jacket off the nail by the door and walked out. The cold hit him like a wall. "You're making it worse," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The driver's window came down. A young man, early 30s, jaw tight, with embarrassment, and something that looked like authority. "We just need a moment. You need a board under your rear wheel. Or a tow. You've got maybe 10 minutes before that ridge freezes around you completely." Ethan crouched in the snow and looked at the tire. "Wait here." He went back into the garage. Lily was sitting on the wooden stool in the corner, the one he'd built her when she was 4, drawing in a sketchbook with a purple crayon. She was 7 now, and had long since graduated to pencils, but purple crayons were still her medium for what she called important drawings. "Who's outside?" she asked without looking up. "Car stuck in the snow." "Is it Tuesday?" It was. Every Tuesday, Ethan helped someone. He'd been doing it since Lily was 2, though she'd only started to understand it in the last year. She'd started to watch for it. Sometimes she'd whisper before they left the house, "It's Tuesday, Dad," like a reminder to keep his eyes open. "Yeah," he said. "It's Tuesday." He found the plywood offcuts he kept in the back corner and carried 2 boards out into the snow. The driver watched him with that particular expression of a man receiving help he didn't ask for and isn't sure he deserves. Ethan wedged the boards under the rear tires. Now. Slow. No throttle. The car crept forward. 1 foot. 2. Then it was free, idling on the flat road, wipers clicking against the snow. Ethan picked up his boards and started back toward the garage. "Wait." The voice was different. It came from inside the car. A rear passenger window had come down, and the voice that emerged was a woman's, controlled, precise, the kind of voice that spends its days in boardrooms and doesn't soften easily. "How much do I owe you?" Ethan turned around. He could see her through the gap. Dark coat, dark hair. A face that was striking in the way that certain faces are when the person behind them has never quite learned to let their guard down. "Nothing," he said. Silence. "A beat too long. I'd like to pay you," she said again. Not warmly, just firmly. "It's Tuesday," Ethan said, which was not an explanation she had any context for, and he didn't offer one. He turned back toward the garage. "Sir." Her voice again. Still controlled, but with something underneath it, now. Something pulled tight. "My daughter needs to use the restroom. She's in a wheelchair, and I'd rather not." She stopped. Just for a second. Then, "We've been on the road for 4 hours. Ethan stopped walking. He stood in the snow for a moment with his back to the car, the plywood boards under his arm, and he looked at the garage door. At the light coming out of it. At the wooden stool, where Lily was still drawing, he turned around. "Bring her in," he said. There are places that tell you everything about a person before the person says a word. Ethan's garage was 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep. One wall was tools organized, well used, nothing decorative. One wall was shelving, oil, brake fluid, a row of manuals, a coffee maker that had stopped being new a long time ago. The floor was stained in the geography of 10 years of work. In the corner, furthest from the cold, the stool, the drawings, a folding table with crayons, sorted into jars by color, and along the back wall, half hidden behind a canvas tarp, the other work, sketches, diagrams, mechanical drawings rendered in precise pencil, numbered and dated, stacked in cardboard boxes, and pinned directly to the bare drywall. Joints, load-bearing angles, weight distribution models, pressure point calculations drawn in the small, careful handwriting of someone who taught himself to think this way at 2 in the morning after everyone else was asleep. Ethan had never shown anyone those drawings. Not the neighbors, not the men who brought their trucks in on Saturday mornings, not even Lily. Not really, she'd asked once, and he'd said they're for a project, and she'd gone back to her crayons without pressing, because at 7 she already understood that her father had rooms in himself he kept the lights off in. He moved the canvas tarp in front of the drawings before he went back out to help. The girl's name was Sophie. He knew it because the woman, her mother, said it when the driver lifted the wheelchair from the trunk. Not loudly, just, Sophie, careful, in that clipped way of someone who has said those 2 words so many times they've become a single sound. Sophie was 15. That was his first guess, looking at her face. Maybe 16. A face that had been through something and had decided to continue anyway. Which gives certain faces a quality of quiet that sits heavier than it should at that age. She was in a wheelchair that probably cost more than his truck. Titanium frame, custom lateral supports, pneumatic wheels. Someone had spent real money on this chair. And yet, he watched her being wheeled up the ramp he kept by the side entrance he'd built it 3 years ago. For reasons he'd never explained to anyone, and even from 6 feet away, in the dim afternoon light, he could see it. The way her hips sat, the tilt, barely perceptible if you didn't know what you were looking at. He knew what he was looking at. The brace she wore on her left leg peeking below the hem of her coat, running from mid-thigh to ankle, was slightly off. 10 degrees, maybe 12. Not at the ankle, where you'd naturally look. At the hip, where the load was supposed to transfer but wasn't. He didn't say anything. He showed them the restroom at the back of the garage, made sure the doorway was wide enough. It was, barely, which was why he'd widened it himself 2 years ago, and put the kettle on the 2-burner camp stove he kept on the workbench. Lily was watching the woman with big eyes. "Hi," Lily said. The woman looked at her. Something shifted in her face, not warmth exactly, but the recognition of a child in the room, which requires a different kind of armor than the one she usually wore. "Hello, I'm Lily. My dad helps people on Tuesdays." The woman looked at Ethan, who was measuring coffee grounds and not looking at anyone. "Does he?" she said. "He's the best at it," Lily said, with complete conviction. "Even better than Mr. Patterson next door, and Mr. Patterson built a whole wheelchair ramp for the Hendersons." The woman's eyes moved to the ramp at the side entrance, then back to Ethan. He still wasn't looking at her. When Sophie came back from the restroom, Ethan handed her mother a mug without asking if she wanted one. He held a second mug toward Sophie and raised his eyebrows. "Yes or no?" She almost smiled. "Yes. Please." He handed it to her. Then he crouched down, not in a way that made her look down at him, but level, which took some doing given the height of the chair, and he looked at her left leg. "At the brace. Does it hurt?" he said. Not "how do you feel," or "are you comfortable," or any of the versions of that question that are really about the person asking it. 3 words. Direct. Like the answer mattered. Sophie looked at him for a long moment. Like she was checking whether this was a real question. "Every single day," she said. Victoria Hale had a calendar that ran 6 weeks in advance, and a team of 7 people whose job was to make sure she was never surprised. She was surprised. She was sitting in a garage in a neighborhood she'd never driven through before, holding a mug of coffee that she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to put down, watching a man in a stained jacket crouch beside her daughter's wheelchair and look at the brace with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not pity. She knew pity. She'd been drowning in it for 11 years. Since Sophie was 4. Since the diagnosis. Since the succession of specialists in the succession of clean offices who all said the same things in different orders and charged different amounts for the same outcome. Limited, they said. Managed, they said. Realistic expectations, they said. And she had become very good at realistic expectations, which is another way of saying she had learned how not to hope for certain things. This man was not looking at her daughter with pity. He was looking at the brace the way a mechanic looks at an engine that's been misdiagnosed. Assessing. Precise. His eyes moved from the hip joint to the knee to the ankle and back again. And she watched his jaw tighten at something he found. When did you get this brace? He said. 8 months ago, Sophie said. It's supposed to be the best. Who told you that? The doctor. Which doctor? Victoria set her mug down on the workbench. I don't see how that's relevant. He looked up at her then. Not rudely. Just directly. Which was somehow more unsettling. The load transfer on this brace is designed for someone with reduced hip mobility. Sophie has hip mobility. She's compensating for a misaligned contact point at the greater trochanter, which is why it hurts. He paused. That's not a medical diagnosis. I'm not a doctor, but the geometry is wrong. Silence. Lily looked up from her drawing. The kettle ticked as it cooled. You can't know that, Victoria said. From looking at it, I can know that from looking at it. Not defensive. Just accurate. Victoria pulled out her phone. Her hand was steady. She had trained herself, over years of boardrooms and negotiations and crisis calls at 2 a.m., to keep her hand steady. She pulled up the number for Douglas Reeves, Sophie's orthopedic specialist at Denver Health, a man with a wall of credentials and 22 years of experience. I'm going to call Mom. Sophie's voice was quiet, but it stopped Victoria the way very few things did. Let him finish. His name was Noah, his younger brother, 26 when the accident happened, which made him 23 when Ethan dropped out of the MIT mechanical engineering program to come home and take care of him, which made Ethan 25, which is old enough to know what you're giving up and young enough to still be angry about it. Noah was funny. The kind of funny that wasn't trying to be the accidental kind, where he'd say something at dinner that made you snort your drink and then look at him and he'd be completely earnest, no idea why it was hilarious. He could fix anything. Before the accident, he worked at a bicycle shop, and he could diagnose a problem by sound, standing 20 feet away, one ear cocked like a hunting dog. After the accident, he couldn't feel his legs. The hospital was careful and thorough, and completely honest about what they could and couldn't do. And what they couldn't do was give Noah his legs back. What they could do was a series of braces and procedures and recommendations that cost, in total, more money than Ethan had or could reasonably acquire. He had taken out loans. He had called everyone he knew. He had worked 3 jobs for 4 months and watched Noah watch the ceiling of his apartment bedroom and go quieter every week. He told Ethan one night, near the end, "Help people like me. Don't let them lose hope. That's all I need from you." He died of a pulmonary embolism 7 months later. A complication. Common, the doctors said, in cases like his. The word common sat in Ethan's chest like a stone for a long time. He was 27. He had a mechanical engineering background, half a degree, and a grief that had nowhere useful to go. He found a garage in Denver, learned auto mechanics because it paid, and started spending his nights in the back corner with graph paper and pencils and everything he could find about orthotics, biomechanics, and load-bearing joint design. He married Claire when he was 30. She knew about the drawings. She'd called them his night work and made him coffee at midnight, without asking why. She died when Lily was born, a complication, the doctors said, which is a word Ethan had stopped being able to hear in the same way after Noah. Now it was just him and Lily, and the garage, and the Tuesdays. He had never told Sophie any of this. He stood in the garage and described the geometry of her brace with the measured calm of someone who had been studying this problem for 7 years, and she listened with the full attention of a person who has spent a long time not being listened to. He didn't promise anything. He said, "I can try." And Sophie said, "Okay." And Victoria, who had spent 11 years becoming a woman who did not trust easily, who had been burned by hope in the specific and brutal way that only parents of sick children can be burned. Victoria said nothing at all. She just didn't leave. The first one took 11 days. Ethan ordered the materials, online medical-grade aluminum, thermoplastic sheet, a set of precision hinges he'd been looking at for 2 years but hadn't had a reason to buy. He worked on it at night after Lily was in bed. The garage lit by 2 work lights clamped to the ceiling joists. The diagrams spread across every flat surface. Lily woke up one night at 11 and found him there, surrounded by cut aluminum and paper calculations. She stood in the garage door in her pajamas for a moment, then went back inside and came back with a blanket, which she draped over the stool in the corner and sat down on without saying anything. He worked for another hour while she dozed. When he carried her back to her bed, she woke up briefly and said, "Is it for Sophie?" "Yeah," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to sleep. Sophie and Victoria came back on a Saturday. The driver waited in the car. Ethan laid the prototype on the workbench. It was roughly 50% lighter than Sophie's current brace, with a redesigned hip joint that transferred load through a different contact path. He'd modeled it on graph paper 40 times before he cut the first piece of metal. "Can I put it on?" Sophie said. He looked at Victoria. She looked at the brace. He could see her working through it. The calculations of risk, of hope, of what it means to let yourself want something you've been trained not to want. She nodded once. He helped Sophie transfer the brace, made small adjustments at the hip joint with a hex wrench, watching the alignment. Then he stepped back. "Stand up slowly. Don't try to walk. Just stand." Sophie gripped the chair arms, pushed herself upright. Stood. She'd stood before, that wasn't the point. The point was her face when she did it. The usual tension, the anticipatory flinch against pain, wasn't there. Not fully. She stood with her weight distributed the way it was supposed to be distributed, and she looked down at her legs with an expression that was almost confused, like a familiar room had been rearranged while she wasn't looking. "It doesn't," she started. "Don't say it yet," Ethan said quietly. "Take 2 steps." She took 2 steps. She stopped. She looked up. Lily, who had been holding herself completely still in the corner, with the focused seriousness of a 7-year-old performing a sacred duty, let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a shout, and then clapped both hands over her own mouth. Sophie laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. Ethan watched it happen and looked away before anyone could see his face. Victoria stood with her hands clasped in front of her and said nothing and said everything. The second prototype took 6 days. He'd already identified the adjustments needed. The knee alignment could be improved. The ankle articulation needed more range. He worked faster now because he understood the shape of the problem. Sophie walked 10 steps this time, down the length of the garage and back. Still a slight unevenness, a ghost of the old compensation pattern in her gait, but the pain was reduced by what she described as almost everything. Victoria, standing by the workbench with her second mug of coffee in 11 days, said, "The company that makes her current brace, Neurobrace, I could make an introduction, if you wanted." "No," Ethan said. She blinked. "Not yet," he said. "There's still something wrong. I don't know what yet, but something." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're very certain?" "I'm certain something is still off. I'm not certain what." He picked up a pencil and went back to the drawing. "Those are different things." Lily, from the corner, said without looking up. "Dad's always like that. He doesn't say things unless he knows them." Victoria looked at the child, then at the man. She sat down on the workbench stool, the only available seat in the garage that wasn't the floor, and watched him work. She stayed for 2 hours. The third prototype was the best thing he'd ever built. He knew it when he held it. The way you sometimes know something is right before you've tested it, not arrogance. Just the particular recognition that comes from enough hours studying a problem. The geometry was clean. The load path was correct. He'd solved the ankle articulation issue by redesigning the joint from scratch, using a mechanism he'd been sketching in the margins of his notebooks for 3 years. Sophie came on a Wednesday. Their schedules had drifted from Saturdays, which should have been a sign of something, but no one named it. Victoria came with her. And this time she didn't bring the driver. She drove herself, a detail Ethan registered without commenting on. He transferred the new brace onto Sophie's leg, made the adjustments, stepped back. "Take your time," he said. She stood. She walked 10 steps, 20, down the garage and back. Her gait was level, smooth. Not perfect, but the kind of imperfect that is the body learning, not the body being denied. She turned at the far end of the garage and looked back at them. She walked faster. Then he would never know if it was the oil patch near the side door, or a slight overcorrection, or simply the fact that the body learning something new sometimes forgets what it already knows. Her left foot caught, and she went down hard. Not a gentle fall. The concrete floor was not gentle. The sound of it moved through the garage like something physical. Ethan was across the space in 2 seconds, crouching beside her, hands moving to check the brace integrity first, because that was the thing that could cause secondary injury. The brace was intact. Sophie had caught herself on her palms, which were scraped but not broken. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright with pain and something else, not fear, he realized. Determination. The face of someone who has already decided this is not the end of the sentence. Victoria crossed the garage in 3 steps and knelt on the concrete without thinking about her coat. "Sophie, I'm okay," Sophie said. "You're not." "I fell," Sophie said. "I fell while walking, Mom." Silence. Victoria sat back on her heels on the cold concrete floor. And for a moment, she looked like a completely different person than the woman who had stepped out of the Rolls-Royce 3 weeks ago. Something had gone out of her face, the armor, the precision, the practiced control. Underneath it, she looked the way parents look when they've been frightened by something they love. Then something else came back in. Something colder. She stood up, took out her phone. Ethan watched her walk to the far end of the garage and make a call. He helped Sophie back to her chair. Lily brought Sophie the blanket from the stool, without being asked. He could hear fragments. "Douglas." "Yes. I know it's late. I need you to be available tomorrow morning." And then, quietly, with her back to the room, "Is there any legal?" And the rest was too low to hear. He understood what she was doing. He couldn't blame her. That was the hard thing. He helped Sophie wipe the concrete dust off her palms and waited. Victoria came back the next morning without Sophie. She stood in the garage door and looked at Ethan with an expression that had been organized and arranged overnight into something professional and final. She held a paper in her hand that he recognized as a document generated by a lawyer. "I can't let this continue," she said. Ethan didn't move from where he stood, leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed, coffee in hand. "Okay, Sophie is." She stopped. "What you're doing is well-intentioned. I understand that. But it's not safe. You're not qualified." His tablet buzzed on the workbench. He glanced at it. A video call. He looked at it for a moment, then at Victoria. "Can you wait 1 second, Mr. Cole? 1 second, please." He picked up the tablet. The face on the screen was a woman in her late 40s. Brown hair pulled back, wearing a white coat. Behind her, the organized chaos of a hospital break room. Cincinnati Children's, he knew. He'd know the background anywhere. "Ethan," the woman said, "I got your message. I had a look at the footage you sent. You have a problem at the ankle, not the hip." "I know," he said. "I corrected for it in the 3rd version, but I overcorrected. The compensatory dorsiflexion is at the subtalar joint," she said. "Not the talocrural. You're locking the wrong axis." She held up a drawing. "Here. See?" Victoria had gone very still. Ethan turned the tablet toward her, not explaining, just showing. This is Dr. Rachel Hayes. She's a pediatric orthopedic specialist at Cincinnati Children's. She's also... He paused. She was married to my wife's brother. We've been in contact for about 4 years. He turned the tablet back. Rachel, I'm putting you on speaker. The woman next to you, Rachel said. And her voice was careful now, professional. I'm assuming she's the parent. Yes, Victoria said. I am, Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale. I've reviewed Ethan's prototypes remotely. I want to be clear about 2 things. First, what he's built is structurally sound. The load path correction he identified is correct, and the major orthopedic specialists I've consulted with here agree with his fundamental analysis. Second, the fall yesterday happened because of a specific mechanical error at the subtalar joint that is correctable. A pause. He's not a licensed practitioner, I know that, but the engineering work he's done is real. I've been watching him develop this framework for 3 years. Victoria looked at Ethan. Why didn't you tell me, she said, that you had this kind of support? Because it wasn't relevant until now. He set the tablet down. I needed to solve it first. She looked at the paper in her hand. She looked at the tablet. She looked at the door, as if measuring the distance to the car. Then she put the paper in her coat pocket. Show me the correction, she said. He needed a proof of concept. Not for Victoria, she was already inside the decision, whether she'd admitted it to herself or not. He needed it for himself. He needed to see the correction work on a body other than Sophie's before he put it back on her leg. Walter Harris was 76, a retired machinist who'd been Ethan's neighbor for 6 years and who had, in that time, received exactly 4 tows out of snow-filled driveways and 1 rebuilt carburetor that Ethan refused payment for. He had a gait problem, post-surgical, that his physical therapist had been managing with a standard orthotic that helped some. Ethan came to him with the corrected design and a careful explanation. Walter listened. He asked 2 questions, good mechanical questions, the kind a machinist asks, about material fatigue and joint tolerance. Ethan answered them. Well, Walter said, I've been watching you drag yourself around that garage for 6 years, and I've been wondering when you were going to do something with those notebooks. He held out his foot. Try it. It took 40 minutes to fit and adjust. Then, Walter stood up, walked across his kitchen, turned, and walked back. He stopped in the middle of his kitchen and stood still for a moment. Well, he said again. His voice was different this time, lower. His wife, Margaret, was watching from the doorway. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Walter took another step, and another. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the snow-covered yard. And Ethan could see from across the kitchen that his shoulders were shaking slightly. He turned around. His eyes were red. How much do I owe you? Walter said. Nothing, Ethan said. It's Tuesday. It was Thursday. Walter knew that. He didn't say anything. He came back to the garage and called Victoria. There's something I want you to see, he said. Bring Sophie. The letter from Neurobrace Incorporated arrived on a Thursday morning, 9 days after Walter Harris walked across his kitchen. It was 3 pages, dense with legal language, and it said in various formal ways that Ethan Cole was manufacturing and distributing unlicensed medical devices, that he was causing harm, that he was infringing on proprietary design elements protected under multiple patents, and that if he did not immediately cease all related activities, he would face a civil suit that the letter implied he could not afford, which was probably true. He read it once, set it on the workbench, and went back to work. Lily found it that evening and read it. She was a very good reader for 7, and then came and stood next to him while he was working, and said nothing for almost a minute. Are you scared? She finally said. He considered the question seriously. No, he said. Me neither, she said, which was either brave or an imitation of him. And he wasn't sure which was more moving. Victoria found out about the letter before he told her he wasn't sure how, and he didn't ask. She called him on a Saturday morning, and the voice on the phone was not the boardroom voice or the worried mother voice or any of the other versions he'd heard. It was something flatter and more certain. "I'm going to make some calls," she said. "You don't have to. I'm going to make some calls, Ethan." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay. Also, Sophie wants to come on Tuesday. She can come any day." "She wants to come on Tuesday," Victoria said. "She says she knows what that means." He stood in the garage with the phone pressed against his ear and said nothing for a moment, which was enough. The footage of Walter Harris started circulating without anyone's plan or permission. Ethan had let a local reporter named Greg Abrams come through the garage 2 weeks earlier. Greg did a small neighborhood column and had been asking for 6 months, and Ethan had finally said yes, mostly because Greg was persistent and quiet, which he respected. Greg had filmed on his phone, just documentary footage, nothing intended for wide release. But Walter's daughter had shared the clip from Greg's column, and someone else had shared it. And within 48 hours of Neurobrace sending their legal letter, the clip had been seen by enough people that the comment section of the column was full of strangers from states Ethan had never visited. He didn't watch any of it. He knew it was happening because Victoria told him and because his phone started ringing from numbers he didn't recognize, which he also didn't answer. What he did do, on that Tuesday, was open the garage door, go back to his workbench, and start working on version 4. Neighbors started appearing. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way people in a neighborhood show up when something is happening. Carl from across the street, who had never spoken to Ethan about anything except weather and sports, came and stood in the garage door for a while and then asked if he needed coffee. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought a casserole at noon. An older man Ethan didn't recognize well sat in a lawn chair he'd brought himself and read a newspaper without speaking to anyone, which was either support or curiosity. And Ethan decided it was support. Lily drew a sign in the garage. It said, in purple crayon, "Doing good is not illegal." She held it up and showed it to Ethan. He looked at it for a long time. "That's good," he said. She propped it up against the workbench. The FDA hearing was in a federal building in downtown Denver. March by then, the snow finally thinning. The mountains still white, but the streets beginning to show gray through it. Victoria had arranged representation a healthcare attorney named James Whitfield, who had argued 3 FDA cases and who sat with Ethan the morning before the hearing and explained what would happen and what they needed. "Tell the truth," Whitfield said. "Don't use more words than necessary. When they ask technical questions, answer the technical question and stop." "That's generally how I operate," Ethan said. Whitfield looked at him. "Good." Victoria had also arranged for Dr. Rachel Hayes to appear, which had involved a flight from Cincinnati that Rachel had paid for herself, which Ethan found out about afterward, and which he couldn't figure out how to address, because he didn't have the vocabulary for that kind of gratitude. And she had arranged for Dr. Adrian Caldwell, a biomechanics professor from Stanford with a publication list that ran 14 pages, who had reviewed Ethan's prototypes and design documentation, and had written a formal analysis that Whitfield now held in a folder. Ethan sat at the table in the hearing room and looked at the panel of 7 people across from him and thought about Noah. Just briefly. He thought, "I'm here." The hearing ran 4 hours. They challenged his credentials, which he didn't have. He explained what he did have: the design documentation, the testing methodology, Dr. Hayes's clinical review, Dr. Caldwell's structural analysis, and Mr. Walter Harris, who was sitting in the gallery with a quiet dignity that was worth more than any credential, because he had walked into that room on legs that moved the way legs were supposed to move. They asked about the fall. He described it exactly. The oil patch, the overcorrection, the specific mechanical error he'd already identified and corrected before the hearing. He described it the way he described everything, with precision and without defensiveness, which seemed to surprise people who had expected one or the other. They showed the footage of Sophie walking, not the short clip. The long version, which Victoria had provided, that showed Sophie walking across the garage, turning, walking back, the quality of her gait, the absence on her face of the thing that had always been there before. Then Dr. Caldwell stood up and said what she'd written in her 14-page analysis. which she compressed into 6 minutes of technical testimony that was quiet and absolute. Then Rachel stood and said what 11 years of pediatric orthopedics looks like when it is paying attention. Then the panel asked for a recess. During the recess, Sophie came and found Ethan in the hallway. She'd been sitting in the gallery with Lily, the two of them side by side. He wasn't sure when they'd become the kind of friends who sit together without needing to explain it. Sometime in the past 6 weeks. He'd stopped noticing it happen. She was on the brace now, version 4, and she walked down the hallway toward him with the particular focus of someone practicing a skill they intend to keep. She stopped in front of him. "Thank you," she said. "We don't know the outcome yet," he said. "I'm not thanking you for the outcome," she said. "I'm thanking you for asking." He didn't need clarification. She turned and walked back down the hallway. He watched her go and kept his face the same as it always was, which took more effort than usual. When the panel came back, they took another 40 minutes to go through the documentation, ask 3 more questions, and confer in low voices at the far end of the table. Then, provisional approval for continued supervised clinical development. A requirement for formal partnership with a licensed medical device company before distribution. A requirement for full clinical trials before any commercial release. Not everything, not a rubber stamp. But the door open, which was different from the door closed. Victoria, sitting 2 seats down from Ethan, did not react visibly. She wrote something in her notepad. Then she wrote something else. Then she looked up and across the room and found Sophie in the gallery. Sophie was already looking at her. The room had other people in it, doing other things, having other conversations. In the middle of all of it, the two of them looked at each other across the hearing room with the specific weight of 11 years of a relationship that had been trying to find its way back to itself. Sophie stood up. She walked across the room. 20 feet, maybe 25. The length of the gallery. The kind of distance that used to cost her something and now cost her less, not nothing but less. She stopped in front of Victoria. She said, "Mom," and then she said, "I forgive you." It was not a dramatic sentence the way dramatic sentences usually are. It was the quietest thing in the room. Victoria heard it the way you hear something that has been traveling toward you for a very long time. She sat down, right there, in a chair that happened to be behind her, and she put her face in her hands. The room around them continued its business. Ethan stood near the doorway with Lily beside him, her hand in his, and neither of them said anything. 3 months later, in late May, when the snow was entirely gone from the Denver streets, and only the highest peaks were still white, Ethan's garage was still a garage. He had been offered 3 different things during those months. A buyout from a medical device firm in California, a partnership offer from a hospital network in Boston, and a research position at the University of Colorado's Biomedical Engineering Department. He'd turned down the first 2. He was still thinking about the third. The garage was still a garage because the garage was what he knew how to do, and because Walter Harris still brought his truck in on Saturdays, and because the neighborhood still had people whose cars needed work, and because Lily's stool was in the corner and the purple crayons were sorted into their jar. But the canvas tarp in the back corner was gone. The drawings were there on the wall, all of them. Every version, every calculation, and they were still there because he'd decided they didn't need hiding anymore. He'd decided that sometime around the hearing, when Dr. Caldwell had held up his design documentation in front of the panel and said, "This is careful work," and he'd had to sit very still with that sentence for a moment before he could continue. The Cole Kindness Mobility Center opened in a building 4 blocks from the garage. Not because of the trial results, those were still running. Because Victoria, who had spent 11 years running a biotech company, had identified the operational structure in 3 days and begun executing it in 6. The center was a collaboration. Her funding and infrastructure, Rachel's clinical oversight, Dr. Caldwell's academic framework, and Ethan's design work, continuing, iterating, getting better. 200 patients in the first 3 months. Not all of them cases like Sophie's. Some of them simpler. Some more complex. All of them people whose geometry was slightly wrong. who had learned to compensate, who had stopped asking if it hurt because no one had given them a reason to believe the answer mattered. They went to the mountains on a Sunday. Late May, the pass open, the road up to the lake clear enough. The lake was mostly thawed. Patches of ice still at the far edges, along the shadow line of the tree-covered shore. But the center was open water, gray-blue, still. Sophie walked to the edge of the lake on packed snow. On version 5 of the brace, lighter than 4. More articulated, the result of 3 additional months of work and 2 clinical adjustments that Rachel had supervised remotely. She stood at the water's edge and looked at the mountains. Then she started to run. Not far, not a sprint, just running. The way you do when you can, and you want to, and the ground is flat enough and the air is cold and clean, and the world for a moment is just the sound of your feet and the white all around you, and the distance closing between where you are and where you're going. Lily ran after her, the 2 of them running on the snow at the edge of the mountain lake. The older girl and the younger one. The gap between them widening because Sophie was faster, both of them laughing at something that wasn't funny but was, somehow, everything. Victoria stood beside Ethan. Neither of them had said much on the drive up, which had taken an hour and a half, and felt like the right length of time. They'd stopped for coffee at a place on the way, the kind of place with a hand-painted sign and a wood stove. And she'd told him about a call she'd had from a family in Ohio, and he'd told her about a design modification he'd been thinking about for a month, and they'd driven the rest of the way in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She watched Sophie run. Then she turned and put her face against his shoulder and cried. Not in the restrained way she had at the hearing, the controlled way, but the other kind, the kind that comes from a place that has been under pressure for a very long time and has finally found a way out. He didn't say anything. He put his arm around her and stood in the snow at the edge of the mountain lake and let it be what it was. After a while, she straightened up, wiped her face, looked at him. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. She looked back at Sophie, who had stopped running and was now crouched in the snow beside Lily, the 2 of them examining something, a rock, a piece of ice. He couldn't tell from here. Sophie was saying something to Lily, and Lily was nodding very seriously. "What did she say to you?" Victoria asked. "At the hearing. What did she tell you?" "That she was thanking me for asking." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Does it hurt?" she said. Like she was testing the words. "Yeah, that's all it took." "That's not all it took," he said. "That's where it started." She looked at him. He was looking at the lake, at the mountains behind it, at the strip of sky above the ridgeline. He was thinking about Noah, the way you think about someone you loved, which is not with sadness exactly, not anymore, but with the particular quality of presence that some people retain in the world long after they're gone from it, not haunting, not grief, just still here, just listening. "We did it," he thought. "We did it, Noah." Sophie, still crouched in the snow beside Lily, picked up a flat stone and turned it over in her hands. Lily was watching her with the patient attention she gave to important things. "A kid at school," Sophie said. "She wears a brace on her arm. She never talks about it." "You should ask her," Lily said. Sophie looked at the stone. "What if she doesn't want to talk about it?" "Then she'll tell you," Lily said. "But maybe she's just waiting for someone to ask." Sophie looked at her for a moment. Then she put the stone down and stood up on legs that still surprised her sometimes. When the morning light was right and she was moving, and the pain wasn't there, when the world was large and white and cold and she was moving through it. "Pay it forward, okay?" she said. Not to Lily exactly. To the mountains, maybe. To the air. Lily looked up at her. "What does that mean?" "It means when you can," Sophie said. "You ask." The lake was still. The mountains were white. The snow held the last light of the afternoon the way snow does from underneath, from inside, and for a moment, everything was luminous, the way some days are when you're not expecting it. 4 people at the edge of a frozen lake in the Colorado mountains. 3 words. That's where it starts. Does it hurt? That's all it takes. 3 words. And a person who means them. That's where miracles begin.